Franjo is completely obsessed with skiing, and over the years, the Matterhorn has become his second home in Zermatt. But one winter day, his routine changed forever when he discovered an injured lynx struggling in the snow along one of his usual routes. Logic told him to keep moving. It was a powerful wild predator, and a storm was closing in. But Franjo didn't walk away. He wrapped the animal in his jacket and carried it down the mountain. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because 5 years later, on the biggest day of his career, Franjo turns toward the tree line and realizes he was never skiing alone. Stay with us. The story that began with a rescue ends with something far more extraordinary. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning Franjo first saw the lynx, the sky above the Matterhorn was so blue and so impossibly clear that it looked like someone had polished it. Sunlight poured across the Swiss Alps in wide, generous sheets, turning every snowfield into a glittering plain of diamonds. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel 10 years younger, and the pine trees along the upper ridgeline stood perfectly still, dark and elegant against all that brightness. Franjo had been skiing these mountains since he was 14 years old, when his uncle first brought him to Zermatt, and he stood at the base of the Matterhorn with his mouth open, struck silent by a beauty he had no words for. Now 19, he knew every contour of the terrain the way a man knows his own handwriting. He could read the snow, its texture, its mood, the subtle shifts in density that told him where the ice hid beneath powder and where the powder ran deep and forgiving. The Matterhorn had become more than a place he visited. It had become, in every way that mattered, a second home. He was Croatian by birth, raised in a small coastal town south of Split, where the Adriatic rolled blue and warm against limestone cliffs. His father, a commercial fisherman named Davor, had never understood the pull of the mountains. "You come from the sea," his father would say, shaking his head. "The sea is in your blood." But Franjo had always been drawn upward, toward altitude and silence, toward the particular loneliness of standing at the top of a slope with nothing between him and the valley floor but gravity and nerve. That January morning, he had started early. He liked to be on the mountain before the resort crowds arrived, when the runs were empty and the snow still held the night's perfection. He was following a familiar off-piste route through a section of old-growth forest, a path that wound between ancient spruce trees and opened onto a wide natural bowl where the powder collected in waist-deep drifts after storms. The previous night had delivered nearly a foot of fresh snow, and the world was hushed and new. He was moving at a moderate pace, enjoying the rhythm of it when he heard the sound. It was faint, a low, ragged noise that didn't belong to the wind or the creak of branches under snow weight. Franjo slowed, then stopped, planting his poles and listening. The sound came again. It was guttural and distressed, almost like a cough, and it was coming from somewhere to his left, deeper in the trees. He unclipped his skis and began walking. 50 yards off the trail, in a shallow depression between two boulders, Franjo found the lynx. It was a Eurasian lynx, a species he had seen only once before, years ago, from a great distance. A fleeting shadow slipping between trees. This one was not slipping anywhere. It lay on its side in the snow, its tawny coat matted and dark with frozen blood along its left hindquarter. One of its rear legs was twisted at an angle that made Franjo's stomach clench. The animal's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. and its amber eyes, enormous, luminous, ringed with the distinctive dark tufts of its species, stared up at Franjo with an expression that he would later describe, to anyone who would listen, as exhausted surrender. It did not snarl. It did not hiss. It simply watched him, as though it had been waiting for something to come, anything at all, and had used up whatever fight it had left. Franjo stood still for a long time. His heart was pounding. A wild lynx was not a creature you approached casually. Even injured, it was a predator equipped with claws that could slice through boot leather and jaws strong enough to bring down a roe deer. Everything he knew about wildlife told him to keep his distance, to mark the location, to go find someone with proper training and equipment. But the temperature was dropping. A bank of clouds was building over the western peaks, and the forecast had warned of an incoming storm system that would bring heavy snowfall by late afternoon. If he left now, walked back to the resort, found help, organized a return trip, hours would pass. The lynx was already hypothermic, already losing blood. He could see the faint steam of its breath growing thinner. Franjo made his decision. He moved slowly, deliberately, speaking in a low, steady voice. He didn't know whether the sound of his words mattered to the animal, but they mattered to him. They kept his own breathing under control, kept his movements smooth and unhurried. He unzipped his outer jacket and carefully, watching the lynx's eyes for any sign of aggression, he knelt beside it. The lynx flinched when he touched its flank. A low growl rumbled in its throat, but it didn't strike. It was too weak, perhaps, or perhaps, and Franjo would wonder about this for years. It understood, in whatever way a wild animal can understand such things, that this human was not a threat. He wrapped the lynx in his jacket, supporting the injured leg as best he could, and lifted it against his chest. The animal weighed perhaps 50 pounds, dense with muscle even in its weakened state. It pressed its face against Franjo's shoulder and went still. The trip down the mountain took nearly 2 hours. Franjo walked in his base layers, the cold biting through his thermal shirt within minutes. He couldn't use his skis while carrying the animal, so he post-holed through deep snow, each step requiring effort, his boots sinking and catching. Sweat froze on his forehead. His arms burned. Twice, the lynx stirred and made that low, pained sound, and Franjo spoke to it again. Nonsense words, just a voice in the cold. When he finally reached the base area, a ski patrol officer named Marco Weiss saw him staggering out of the tree line and ran to meet him. Within 30 minutes, the local wildlife authority had been contacted. A veterinary team from the Swiss Wildlife Conservation Service arrived within the hour. The lynx had a compound fracture of the left rear femur, likely caused by a fall from a rocky ledge, and deep lacerations consistent with a failed attempt to navigate an icy cliff face. It had lost significant blood. The veterinary surgeon, a quiet woman named Dr. Elena Keller, told Franjo plainly that without intervention, the animal would not have survived the incoming storm. "You probably saved its life," she said, studying Franjo with the careful evaluation of someone who spent her career around people who claimed to love wild animals but didn't understand them. "But you need to understand. This is a wild lynx. We will treat it, rehabilitate it, and release it. It won't become a pet. It won't remember you." Franjo nodded. He understood. He asked only if he could know later whether the lynx survived. The recovery took 3 months. Dr. Keller's team performed surgery to pin the fractured femur, treated the lacerations, and managed a secondary infection that developed during the second week. The lynx, cataloged as Subject 247F, a male approximately 4 years old, was kept in a specialized rehabilitation enclosure designed to minimize human contact. They fed it through a chute. They monitored it through cameras. Every protocol was designed to ensure that when the animal returned to the wild, it would retain its natural wariness of people. Franjo received updates by email, brief, clinical messages. Subject 247F, responding well to antibiotics. Weight gain on track. Mobility improving. He read each one with a feeling he couldn't entirely name. Something between relief and longing, as though a small piece of his own life was being measured in those sterile sentences. In April, the lynx was released back into the Matterhorn wilderness. Franjo returned to the mountains that same month, as the last of the season's snow was softening in the spring sun. He wasn't expecting anything. Dr. Keller's words had been clear, and he believed her. Wild animals did not form attachments to humans. That was a story people told themselves because they wanted the world to be more tender than it was. He was skiing a familiar run, a long intermediate slope that wound through a corridor of tall spruce, when he noticed movement at the tree line. He stopped and looked. A lynx stood at the edge of the forest, perhaps 100 yards away. It was perfectly still, its tufted ears pricked forward, its amber eyes fixed on Franjo with an expression of calm attention. It was large for a lynx, with a distinctive dark marking along its left haunch. The scar, Franjo realized, from the injury, from the surgery. His breath caught. The lynx watched him for perhaps 10 seconds, then turned and walked slowly into the trees. Not running, not fleeing, just walking, as though it had confirmed something and was satisfied. Franjo stood alone on the slope for a long time after that, his goggles pushed up on his forehead, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. It happened again the following week, and the week after that. Each time Franjo returned to ski, the lynx would appear. Not always in the same place, and not always immediately. Sometimes Franjo would complete an entire run before catching a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. But there it would be, standing among the trees at a distance that was neither close nor far. A respectful distance, a deliberate one. Sometimes the lynx would pace along the ridge as Franjo skied below, trotting parallel to him through the deep forest, its movements fluid and unhurried. From above, it must have looked remarkable. A man carving turns through powder while a wild cat followed like a silent companion, matching his pace, adjusting its route to stay within sight. Franjo told almost no one. He was afraid, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, that talking about it would break the spell. He mentioned it to his mother, Ivana, during a phone call home, and she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Some things choose us, Franjo. We don't get to understand why." He mentioned it to Marco Weiss, the ski patrol officer, who laughed and said, "The mountain gives you a guardian, and you want to keep it quiet? You Croatians are strange people." But Marco watched for the lynx after that, and saw it once, from a distance, and stopped laughing about it. Franjo never approached the lynx. He never left food for it, never tried to call to it, never did anything that might compromise its wildness. He understood, instinctively and deeply, that the beauty of what was happening depended entirely on its being unforced. The lynx came because it chose to come. It watched because it wanted to watch. The moment Franjo tried to make it into something more, something tame, he would destroy the very thing that made it extraordinary. So he skied, and the lynx watched, and the mountains held them both, Seasons passed. The ritual continued through years that brought both joy and sorrow to Franjo's life. He lost his father, Davor, to a heart attack during a summer fishing trip. Franjo flew home to Split and sat with his mother in the small house by the sea and felt the kind of grief that sits on your chest like a stone. He was only 21, and the world suddenly felt enormous and indifferent. When he returned to the Matterhorn that autumn, the first snowfall had already come, and he went up the mountain alone, not really wanting to ski, just wanting to be somewhere that felt like it understood silence. The lynx appeared within 20 minutes. It sat at the tree line, perfectly composed, and watched Franjo as he stood motionless at the top of a run he had no desire to take. He didn't cry. He wasn't the kind of man who cried easily. But something in his throat ached and his eyes burned, and the lynx simply sat there, present and patient, until the light began to fade, and Franjo finally turned and skied slowly back down. There were other seasons, better ones. Franjo's skiing improved with astonishing speed, his raw talent sharpened by thousands of hours on these slopes. He began entering competitive events, regional races at first, then national ones, then international circuits that took him across the Alps to Austria, France, and Norway. He was young, but he was not reckless. He didn't have the explosive power of some racers or the fearless aggression of the Austrians. But he had something else, a patience, a fluidity, a deep connection to the mountain that allowed him to read the terrain in ways that seemed almost supernatural to his competitors. His coach, a grizzled former Olympic racer named Sandro Hoffman, told a journalist once, "Franjo doesn't fight the mountain. He listens to it. I've never seen anything like it." Through it all, the lynx remained. Not on every visit. There were stretches of weeks when Franjo would ski without seeing it, and he would feel a small, irrational panic that it was gone for good, that the connection had finally dissolved. But it always came back. It would appear at the tree line as though it had never left, a little larger each year, its winter coat growing thicker and more magnificent, the scar on its haunch fading to a thin silver line barely visible beneath the fur. Once, during a heavy snowstorm, Franjo saw the lynx from the chairlift. It was sitting on a rocky outcrop above the run, completely exposed to the falling snow, its tufted ears white with flakes. It looked, Franjo thought, like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Permanent, ancient, part of the landscape in a way that no human being could ever be. He had a name for the lynx, though he never spoke it aloud to anyone. He called it stražar, the Croatian word for sentinel, the watcher, the guardian. The year Franjo turned 24, he qualified for the Winter Olympics. It was the culmination of everything. Every early morning on the mountain, every hour of training, every sacrifice. He had never stood on an Olympic podium. He had placed well in World Cup events, top 10 in several races, a bronze at a European championship. But the Olympic gold had always felt like something that belonged to other skiers. Older ones, more established ones, the ones whose names echoed through alpine history. His body was still young, still hungry, but the field was stacked with veterans who had been chasing this dream far longer than he had. Croatia had never produced an Olympic downhill champion. The weight of that history, or rather, the absence of it, sat on Franjo's shoulders like a second gravity. His mother, Ivana, had called the night before the race, her voice thin and worried across the long-distance line. "You don't have to win," she said. "Just come home safe." But Franjo could hear it beneath her words. The fierce, unspoken pride, the hope she was afraid to voice. The Olympic downhill event was held by a twist of scheduling that felt almost orchestrated by the universe at Bormio, Italy. The Stelvio course at Bormio is one of the most demanding downhill runs in the world. It drops nearly 1,000 meters over 3 kilometers of treacherous terrain, with sections so steep that racers regularly exceed 90 miles per hour. The course is beautiful and unforgiving. It has ended careers. Franjo had raced it once before, in a World Cup qualifier, but never with this much at stake, and never with the quiet, certain knowledge that this single run could define everything he had worked for. The morning of the race was spectacular. The sky was a deep, crystalline blue, unmarked by clouds, and the snow on the course was firm and fast, groomed to perfection. Sunlight flooded the valley with such intensity that the mountains seemed to glow from within, the snow reflecting light upward so that even the shadows were luminous. It was the kind of day that reminded you why people fell in love with winter. Franjo stood in the start gate, his poles planted, his goggles down, his breathing controlled. Below him, the course fell away in a series of sweeping turns and compression zones that he had memorized years ago. He could hear the crowd in the finish area, distant and muffled by altitude. His race number, 17, flapped in the slight breeze. He thought of his father, standing on the dock in Split with fish scales on his hands and a puzzled expression. "You come from the sea." He thought of his mother, sitting in her kitchen in Split with the radio on, listening to the race broadcast in a language she barely understood. He thought of Sandro, his coach, standing somewhere in the finish area with a stopwatch and a face that never showed emotion until the moment it did. And he thought of the lynx. He didn't look toward the tree line. He didn't need to. Either Strajar was there or it wasn't, and either way, Franjo was going to ski this run the way he had always skied. Not fighting the mountain, but listening to it. The starting signal beeped. Franjo launched himself out of the gate. The first section was a steep pitch into a hard left turn, and Franjo took it low and tight, his edges biting into the firm snow with a sound like tearing paper. The speed built rapidly, 60, 70, 80 miles per hour, and the world narrowed to a tunnel of white and blue. The wind screaming past his helmet, his body folded into a tuck so compact that he could feel his chin nearly touching his knees. He hit the course's famous compression at full speed, and the G-force slammed through his legs like a freight train, but he absorbed it, his muscles remembering what his conscious mind had long since stopped calculating. He was in the flow now, that place beyond thought where the body and the mountain become a single system, where every micro-adjustment of weight and angle happens automatically, instinctively, perfectly. The middle section was where Franjo had always excelled, a long, gliding traverse that rewarded patience and precision over raw power. He held his tuck, let the skis run, and felt the mountain give him speed the way a river gives a boat current. He was fast. He knew he was fast. The snow hissed beneath him like a whisper, and the trees on either side blurred into a continuous wall of green. The final section was a series of violent turns ending in a steep shuss to the finish. This was where careers ended, where the mountain tested your nerve and your exhaustion and your willingness to hold your line when every instinct screamed at you to break. Franjo had seen men crash here, had seen bones break and dreams shatter in explosions of snow and flying equipment. He held his line. The final turn came and went in a blur of centrifugal force and precise, impossible edging. The schuss opened up before him, and Franjo dropped into his tuck one final time and let gravity do what gravity does. The finish line rushed toward him. The crowd noise swelled. He crossed the line. The clock stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Or what felt like silence, though thousands of people were screaming. Then the numbers appeared on the scoreboard, and Franjo couldn't read them because his goggles had fogged and his eyes were streaming from the wind. But he could read the crowd, and the crowd was telling him something he had never heard before. He had won. Not by a comfortable margin, by 0.12 of a second, a distance so small it was almost philosophical. But he had won. At 24 years old, a virtual unknown on the world stage, Franjo had won the Olympic gold medal in the men's downhill at Bormio. He stood in the finish area, bent over his poles, his lungs heaving, his legs trembling with the deep electric fatigue of a body that had given everything it had. Sandro reached him first, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him, his weathered face cracked open in a rare, enormous grin. Marco Weiss was there somehow, having traveled all the way from Zermatt, tears running freely down his cheeks, shouting something in a jumble of German and Italian that Franjo couldn't process. Cameras appeared, microphones, hands reaching to shake his, to pound his back, to pull him into embraces. But in the middle of all that noise and motion, Franjo straightened up and turned away from the crowd. He pushed his goggles up onto his helmet and looked toward the tree line. The forest rose behind the finish area in a dark, steeply angled wall of spruce and fir, and the late afternoon light was painting the treetops in shades of amber and pale gold. The shadows between the trunks were soft and deep and still. And there, at the edge of the trees, perhaps 200 yards away, a lynx sat perfectly motionless. It was large. Its winter coat was thick and pale, its tufted ears dark at the tips, and along its left haunch, just barely visible, ran a thin silver line. It sat with the composed stillness of a creature that had all the time in the world, its amber eyes catching the fading light, fixed on Franjo with an expression that was neither curious nor alarmed, but simply, quietly, present. Franjo stared back. The noise of the crowd faded to a distant hum. The cameras, the officials, the other racers. All of it receded to the edges of his awareness until there was nothing in the world but a man standing in the snow and a lynx watching from the forest. They regarded each other across that distance, across 5 years of shared mountains and silent companionship, and something passed between them that Franjo could never describe to anyone, no matter how many times he tried. It was not gratitude exactly. It was not love, at least not in any human sense. It was something older and simpler. A recognition, maybe. An acknowledgement that they had traveled together through something vast and beautiful and fleeting, each in their own way, and that this moment, this golden afternoon in the mountains they both called home, was a fitting place for the story to reach its fullest expression. The lynx held his gaze for a long, still moment. Then, without hurry, it rose to its feet, turned, and walked into the trees. Franjo watched until the last flicker of tawny fur disappeared into the forest shadows. Then he turned back to the crowd, where Sandro was waiting with the kind of expression that meant he had seen the whole thing and would never mention it, and Marco was blowing his nose loudly into a handkerchief. A journalist pushed forward, microphone extended. "Franjo, how does it feel? An Olympic gold medal in your first games. Can you describe this moment?" Franjo thought about it. He thought about his father and the sea. He thought about his mother and the radio. He thought about the morning 5 years ago when the sky was impossibly blue, and he found a broken creature in the snow and carried it down the mountain because leaving it there was simply not something he could do. "I wasn't alone out there," he said. "I've never been alone on this mountain." The journalist frowned, waiting for elaboration. Franjo smiled and said nothing more. He returned to the Matterhorn later that same winter, the Olympic gold medal tucked in a drawer back in Zermatt, where he kept his father's fishing knife and a photograph of his mother on her wedding day. He skied the old familiar routes, not training now, just skiing for the pure joy of it. He watched for the lynx. He saw it twice that season. The first time, it was early morning, and the lynx was moving through the trees above the trail, its footprints leaving a delicate chain of marks in fresh snow that glittered warmly in a band of golden sunrise. It paused and looked down at Franjo, and Franjo looked up, and the moment held before the lynx moved on, graceful and unhurried. The second time, in late March, the lynx was not alone. It sat at the tree line in the mild, buttery light of early spring, and beside it, tumbling and pouncing in the snow with comical, oversized paws, were two cubs. Franjo stopped and stared, his mouth open. The lynx, his Strajar, turned its head and regarded him with that familiar calm, those amber eyes steady and clear. One of the cubs noticed Franjo and froze, then bolted behind its parent. The other one kept playing, oblivious. Franjo laughed. It came out of him unbidden, a full, warm sound that echoed off the slopes, and the lynx's ears rotated toward the noise with what Franjo chose to interpret as tolerant amusement. "You've been busy," Franjo said softly. The lynx blinked. Then it stood, nudged its cubs with its nose, and led them back into the forest, the warm afternoon light filtering through the canopy, dappling their retreating forms in patches of honey and shadow until the trees gathered them in and they were gone. Franjo stood there in the gentle warmth of the spring day, the mountain quiet and kind around him, and felt something settle into place in his chest. A completeness, a rightness. He had given the mountain the best years of his life, and in return, the mountain had given him this: a wild and wordless friendship, a companion who asked nothing, who judged nothing, who simply showed up season after season, to walk the same ridges and watch the same slopes and share, in its own way, the particular joy of being alive in a beautiful place. It was, Franjo thought, the greatest prize he had ever won. He clicked into his bindings and pushed off down the slope, skiing easily now, no longer racing, the spring snow soft under his edges and the light falling warm and golden across the valley. Somewhere in the forest behind him, a lynx was teaching its cubs to walk in the wild. The mountains held them all,